Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Apostolic Islam, where today we will be continuing our series on the Bible being corrected by the Qur'an, focusing on the staff story. This episode will be a bit more advanced as we assume some familiarity with the widely held view of the Pentateuch as a combination of multiple sources, including the documentary hypothesis and the supplementary hypothesis. So we suggest Richard Friedman's work, Who Wrote the Bible, which is available for free online as a primer or for further reading. However, for our discussion here, all that one needs to know is that we can identify different sources in the Pentateuch. In the book of Exodus, we find the story of the signs God had commanded Moses and Aaron to perform. But this intriguing narrative is far from straightforward. Let us embark on a journey through the mysteries of this ancient account, where scholars seek to unravel the hidden layers among its passages using source criticism. The account of these signs is a combination of more than one source. While the documentary hypothesis is almost obsolete in Europe, the majority of scholars acknowledge the existence of multiple sources or layers that have contributed to the formation of the final text as we know it. One of the curious elements is the enigmatic staff, a conduit of divine power. Was it Moses' staff or Aaron's? Was Moses supposed to perform the miracles using the staff, or was it Aaron? In Exodus 4, Yahweh demonstrates his power to Moses by transforming his staff into a snake and back again. This miraculous sign serves as proof to the Israelites that Moses is indeed sent by God. In verse 17, Yahweh provides the final instruction to conclude the lesson. Quote, "Take in your hands this staff with which you shall perform the signs." End quote. Once again, the text leaves no room for doubt as it clearly conveys that Moses is the designated individual entrusted with wielding the staff to execute miraculous deeds in verses 20 to 21. So Moses went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. Yahweh said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do so." But later on in chapter 7 verse 10, it is stated that Aaron threw his staff and then it transformed into a snake. In Exodus chapter 9 verse 23, Moses uses his staff to bring the plague of hail. Then in Exodus chapter 10 verse 13, Moses once again uses his staff to bring the plague of locusts. The confusion persists in the sign of the water transforming into blood. I will quote the verses to demonstrate this. Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Take in your hand the staff that was turned into a snake. Say to him, 'See, with the staff that is in my hand I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall be turned to blood.'" Those were verses 14 to 18. Next, Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over waters of Egypt, over its rivers, its canals, and its ponds, and all its pools of water, so that they may become blood." That was verse 19. Next, Moses and Aaron did just as Yahweh commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and of his officials, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the river, and all the water in the river was turned into blood, and the fish in the river dried. Verses 20 to 21. In verse 17, Moses initiates the miracle using his staff, while in verse 19, Aaron does the same using his staff. Pay special attention to the singular pronoun he, which is grammatically at odds with its plural antecedent. Notice the difference between the actions done to initiate the plague. Aaron stretches out his hand with the staff in his hand, while Moses strikes the Nile with his staff. The mention of striking with the use of the singular pronoun he confirms that it refers to Moses. All of the above examples demonstrate that we are encountering two different sources with two different views. The text leaves clues to the editorial work with different sources combined into this narrative, a testament to the hands of the editing and redactors who shaped the story over generations. Despite numerous theories concerning the sources of the Exodus story, scholars widely agree on the presence of the priestly writer or writers who were linked to the post-exilic Aaronite priesthood. This writer altered an earlier narrative that solely revolved around Moses' staff by incorporating material from priestly source, otherwise known as source P, and as a result, evidence such as story doublets and textual incongruities, such as the singular and plural mismatches that we just saw previously, and distinctive wording was left behind. The priestly source elevated Aaron, enabling him to perform miracles like Moses. And this is also an example of Aaron's elevation, as we just saw above. Richard Elliott Friedman, in his book The Bible with Sources Revealed, states, "It was Moses' staff that was supposed to be used to perform the miracles in E source, but it is Aaron's staff in P source," again being the priestly source. Professor Mark Brettler writes in his article, "The singular he following Moses and Aaron is problematic, and hints that in one source, reflected in the beginning of the verse, Moses and Aaron are working in tandem, while another portrays a single actor, being Moses," the verses 14 to 18 where we quoted above. He also writes, "According to the first, Moses strikes the Nile with his staff, while in the second account in verse 19, the action is initiated when Aaron takes his staff, but does not use it to strike the water, but instead stretches out his hand. The professor here separates the blood plague into two distinct sources. The first source being the non-priestly account of the blood plague. In Exodus 7:14, Yahweh said to Moses, "Pharaoh's heart is heavy with stubbornness. He refuses to send the people free. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. He goes out to the Nile. Station yourself to him, meet him by the shore of the Nile, and the staff that changed into a snake. Take in your hand, and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, Send free my people, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But here you have not hearkened thus far. Thus says Yahweh, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Here I will strike with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it will change into blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will reek, and the Egyptians will be unable to drink from the Nile. He raised his staff and struck the water in the Nile before the eyes of Pharaoh and before the eyes of his servants. And all the water that was in the Nile changed into blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile reeked, and the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. So Pharaoh turned and came into his house. Neither did he pay any mind to this, but all Egypt had to dig around the Nile to drink water, for they could not drink from the waters of the Nile. So that's the first non-priestly source account. Let's look at the priestly account of the blood plague. 7:19. Yahweh said to Moses, Say to Aaron, Take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their tributaries, over the Nile canals, over their ponds, and over all their bodies of water. Let them become blood. There will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, in the wooden containers, in the stoneware. Moses and Aaron did thus, as Yahweh had commanded them. The blood was throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did thus with their occult arts. And Pharaoh's heart remained strong-willed, and he did not hearken to them as Yahweh had spoken. In the non-priestly source, only the Nile water is contaminated, whereas in the priestly source, the entire Egyptian water supply is contaminated. The passage in the non-priestly source is coherent after separation. However, the passage in the priestly source appears to be very clumsy and raises some very odd questions, particularly regarding how the magicians of Egypt were able to replicate Aaron's miracle of transforming all the waters in Egypt, as if they're some kind of prophets, including the water stored in containers into blood, considering it was already transformed. Here are a few explanations that are given. First explanation is that the magicians waited until Aaron's miracle was over. One may suggest that the magicians waited until Aaron's miracle was over before replicating it, but this suggestion is difficult to reconcile with the combined account. It indicates that Pharaoh returned home after the magician's work. However, it seems improbable that the miracle performed by Yahweh's messengers only lasted a few hours, allowing Pharaoh to wait by the Nile until it ended. If it had indeed only lasted a few hours, there would be no reason for them to search for drinkable water by the digging wells. Some may suggest that Pharaoh stayed at the bank of the Nile for days until the plague had ceased, and the magicians replicated it. However, this is also unlikely given the stinking condition of the Nile. Even if we ignore the non-priestly source, the narrative still doesn't make any sense, as a plague lasting only a few hours and ending on its own wouldn't have served any purpose. If one suggests that the magicians waited for several days for the miracle to end and then replicated it, that is also improbable. Why would Pharaoh allow them to extend the plague and cause more trouble? Moreover, why would the magicians themselves want to prolong the trouble? The second explanation is given is that the magicians only did it on a small scale. One may respond to the objection we gave above by saying they did it on a small scale, but even assuming that they did it at a small scale leaves us with the question of what water they had remaining to perform such a feat. The professor we mentioned above believes that the magicians used spring water for their purpose, but he overlooks the fact that if spring water was still available, there would be no reason for the Egyptians to dig wells in search of drinkable water as stated in the non-priestly source. Ignoring the non-priestly source doesn't help resolve this issue because the explanation is contradicted by the expression, there will be blood throughout all the lands of Egypt, in the wooden containers, in the stoneware, etc. Again, we just see a big mishmash of contradictions when you put the two sources together. Therefore, the passage in the priestly source not only exaggerates the events, but also borrows the magician motif from the account of the staff transformation to a snake, which doesn't fit here at all. Let's look at the priestly account of the staff. Exodus 8:1. And the Lord said to Moses, Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with the staff over the rivers, canals, and the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up, and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same with their secret arcs. To keep the discussion brief, I haven't included the separated non-priestly source account of this plague. However, when the separated non-priestly account of this plague is examined, it is also coherent, just like the account of the blood plague. But when it comes to the priestly account of this plague, the magician motif is reused in a similarly clumsy manner. If frogs already covered the land of Egypt, why would the magicians cause more trouble by summoning additional frogs? Why would Pharaoh allow that, especially since he later asked Moses and Aaron to pray to the Lord to take frogs away from being my people? How can someone differentiate between the frogs brought by the magician and the frogs brought by Aaron? Again, just a bunch of questions being raised that can't be answered. Let's look at the priestly account. The priestly account of the insects plague. Exodus 8:12. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and gnats came on humans and animals alike. All the dust of the earth turned into gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not. There were gnats on both humans and animals, and the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Again, to keep the discussion focused, I haven't included the non-priestly account of the plague concerning insects, but in this case, it doesn't need to be separated, because when the priestly source was incorporated, the priestly writer treated it as a separate plague due to differences. In the non-priestly source, the word used is broader, unlike the one used in the priestly source. Therefore, as noted by the Benson commentary, it includes various insects such as flies, gnats, wasps, and hornets. Thus, translations that use insects more accurately represent the original Hebrew. The non-priestly account doesn't raise any questions, but the priestly account raises some questions. Why were they unable to replicate this sign? Their inability to replicate this sign is hard to explain, considering their success in replicating the signs concerning frogs and the ones with the blood as well. Nobel proposes that the thing to be done in this instance was to call creatures into existence and not merely to call forth and change creatures and things already in existence, as in the case of the staff, the water, and the frogs. However, he's mistaken because gnats, like frogs, originate from eggs laid by the previous generation, so their appearance shouldn't be seen as a direct act of creation. The important difference is that frogs lay their eggs in water, whereas gnats lay theirs in the dust or earth. Both the plagues of frogs and gnats shared a common miraculous nature, which did not involve instantaneous creation. Instead, what occurred was an abrupt, supernaturally accelerated process of generation and multiplication. Moreover, according to the priestly source, the magicians were unable to replicate this miracle. They gave up and acknowledged it was the work of God. However, in Exodus 7:12, when the transformed staff swallows up their staffs, they are still unable to replicate the feat of swallowing up their other staffs. Despite their failure, they don't acknowledge the divine nature of this event. If the inability to replicate this is the reason for the acknowledgement, then why didn't they acknowledge it at that point? Their acknowledgement earlier would have been more natural and could have prevented the clumsy reuse of the magician motif. An important thing to note here is that we are not claiming that everything in the priestly source is clumsy and ahistorical. Some accounts in the priestly source may be more primitive and historically plausible when compared to the other one. Additionally, the priestly source includes plausible historical details not mentioned in the other source, despite being added later. The priestly source can also contain true historical details missing in other sources, and at times even narrate a primitive account of events. Therefore, our observation is specific to this topic and should not be generalized. In this regard, while the priestly source narrates an exaggerated, unnecessarily complex and clumsy narrative, it also provides valuable information absent in the other source. Now, after looking at all that, let's look at the Quranic version of events. The Qur'an narrates a primitive version of the staff's transformation. According to the Quranic account, the staff of Moses miraculously transforms into a snake in front of the Pharaoh. In contrast to the later version, where Aaron's staff transformed into a snake, the Quran presents the original account of Moses' staff transformation instead of copying the one from the priestly source. Furthermore, the magicians acknowledge the swallowing up as the work of God, negating the reuse of the magician motif. The Quran also doesn't exhibit the confusion found in the book of Exodus, where multiple sources are combined. Instead, it narrates one very consistent account. It is widely accepted that the Quran is intimately familiar with the Bible, especially with the Pentateuch. Thus, with such a complicated story, the Quran had numerous places where it could have made a mistake by copying and narrating an inconsistent narrative. As we have already discussed, we can also add the population of Nineveh and the Exodus numbers we talked about in other videos. Consequently, the Quran consistently rejects and corrects later ahistorical redactions in the biblical account. This consistent pattern is something we will continue and share upon and expand upon, inshaAllah. وآخر دعوانا والحمد لله رب العالمين.